Hello, everyone. I believe we are now live. So welcome to you all. This is the IRSG's webinar and launch our exciting new report, which we are very pleased to have so many of you here today. We've got a very exciting panel who's going to discuss our report after the authors have presented it. I'm Ilan Jacobs, and I work at Citigroup in our government affairs team, but I'm here today in my role as chair of the IRSG's ESG committee, which has commissioned this report. Those of us that have been working in the field of sustainability for quite a while, some of you a lot more than others, I'm sure, will have become frustrated by the lack of a globally consistent approach to sustainability disclosures. How can investors manage their climate risk, spot opportunities in sustainability, direct their capital flows towards those opportunities and away from the risks out there without decision useful information? Well, the IFRS, well known with a fantastic heritage in financial information standards, launched the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and entered into this space a few years back. And they took that gave us a huge leap forward with the development of both S1 and S2. Those are their two sustainability standards that they were diligently working on. And started setting the benchmark for what could be a really successful, globally applicable standard for investor useful, decision critical sustainability information. The IRSG and the City of London have supported those, as did very many of the industry. But really the next step, having the standards is one thing. The next step is consistent and well-structured implementation. There's no point having a set of globally consistent standards unless jurisdictions around the world are going to implement them and adopt them in a consistent manner to provide global investors with that consistent information. But how to do that? Not a straightforward task. And there are many different national jurisdictions for legal frameworks. Different jurisdictions are at different levels of development of their capital markets. So having a single standard, or two single standards, which can apply globally, but also work in the context of all those differing local situations, really is quite a tricky question. So who better to answer that? Well, the IRSG commissioned and asked Clifford Chance, the global law firm, which you'll be familiar with, to answer those very questions, to have a look at the issue of how best to implement these standards globally and come up with a set of recommendations on how that should work and to advise based on a really impressive and large piece of work, looking at all the different jurisdictions which have adopted so far. And then also looking at what we can learn from the global adoption of TCFD standards in many different jurisdictions. The team at Clifford Chance, led by Adam Hedley and Kate Norgett, have produced a really impressive piece of work, and we're delighted today that they're going to present it to us and talk us through some of the highlights. Hello, Kate, and hello, Adam. Oh, I see you again. Hi, Kate. Hi, Adam. I'm going to hand over to you in a sec, but after Adam and Kate have finished, we're going to then move over to a panel where we're going to talk through some of the challenges that the report throws up and some of the issues which investors, adopters and jurisdictions are facing when it comes to implementing the global standards. And there'll be a chance I'll be asking some questions. There'll be a chance for all of you also to contribute and ask questions through the Zoom function. So please do start to think about those and post them. But before that then, I'm going to hand over to Kate and Adam. Hi there, guys. I'm going to hand over to you to take the mic and talk us through some of the top findings of your report.
Thanks, Ilan. I'm going to go first. Very nice to be here today with everybody. And thank you, Ilan, for the introduction. It's been a pleasure to work on this report with the IRSG, as well as with many of our Clifford Chance colleagues across our network, and with Bowman's in South Africa and Blake's in Canada. Hopefully some of the people joining the call will have read some of the report, but for those that you have not had time to do so, Adam and I are going to give you a quick overview in the next 15 minutes. So as Ilan has already outlined, the ISSB standards aim to provide a global baseline for sustainability reporting. So consistent, comparable and reliable disclosures about sustainability risks and opportunities, building on the very successful TCFD climate-related disclosure framework. And the aim is for disclosures, again, as Ilan said, that are decision useful for investors and other financial market participants, such as banks and insurance companies. The ISSB standards are a great starting point, but as Ilan said, in order to achieve their aim, they need to be implemented across the globe in a coherent manner with a common, ideally with a common supervisory and enforcement approach. And as many jurisdictions are in the process of implementing the standards, we thought it would be a good idea to build on the work that the IFRS Foundation has already started to assist jurisdictions and to monitor how they are implementing. We would have a closer look at this process, what was going on, and if any lessons could be learned by looking at how different countries were implementing the standards. So we looked at 8 countries. We chose Australia, Brazil, Canada, Hong Kong, Japan, South Africa, Turkey, and the UK. So if we could just move on to the next slide. So this slide shows a sort of a brief timeline of how the different jurisdictions are planning to implement the ISSB standards. And it quite clearly shows that there are going to be some delays to the effective or the starting date for reporting. The ISSB standards suggested that the effective date for reporting should be financial years starting on or after the 1st of January 2024. But as you can see on the timeline, only of the jurisdictions that we considered, only Turkey has implemented mandatory sustainability disclosures from this date, with some other jurisdictions expressly permitting reporting like Brazil or encouraging voluntary reporting like the UK ahead of future mandatory requirements. You can also see on the slide that disclosure requirements are being phased in over time. So in Australia, you have 3 waves of reporting, and in Japan, you have a phased approach. And so the good news is that a lot of jurisdictions are taking steps to implement the ISSB standards, which will ultimately lead to globally comparable, decision useful, sustainability related disclosures. But the process is going to take some time. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. So this slide sets out the other key issues and themes arising from our review, which have informed the report's recommendations, which Adam is going to talk about next. Due to timing constraints, I'm just going to talk about about 3 of them. So the first is the production of local standards based on ISSB standards. And what we have seen by looking at the jurisdictions is that they've all opted to have their own local standards, which are aligned with the ISSB standards, but they haven't directly adopted them. So this approach allows for jurisdiction-specific adjustments, and it's also helpful to preparers as all the information that they need is in one place, one set of standards, but it does risk inconsistency in implementation. And as the report sets out and discusses in more detail, the more changes that are included in the local standards, the greater the risk that the aim of the ISSB standards, which is, to deliver globally comparable and decision useful sustainability disclosures, it will be undermined. And so, the message here is that just jurisdictions should really strive to make the minimum changes to the ISSB standards possible. The next point I'm going to talk about is the extension of the transition reliefs in the ISSB standards. And when preparing the ISSB standards, the ISSB was conscious of the need to balance the need of preparers with the needs of investors, which led to the inclusion of transition reliefs in the ISSB standards themselves. But it's clear from our review that these reliefs are helpful. They don't necessarily go far enough. Because 4 out of the 8 jurisdictions, so Australia, Canada, Japan, and the UK, are considering extending, or in the case of Canada, who have published their standards, have extended the transition reliefs. And this sends a message that it may be helpful for preparers to give them more time to collect and verify data that they need to disclose in areas which are challenging. So in particular, disclosure of scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And obviously, this will delay the timing of disclosures, which are available for investors, but hopefully it will ultimately produce higher quality disclosures, which overall will get us into the right place, which is in the interests of investors and the financial markets overall. Then the last point I'm going to talk about is the reliability of disclosures, and in particular whether disclosures should be subject to assurance. And as you may know, in the EU, the CSRD mandates assurance of sustainability disclosures made in accordance with the European sustainability reporting standards. But in relation to ISSB, they have left that decision about whether the disclosures should be assured to the discretion of the implementing jurisdictions. So in our sample of the 8 jurisdictions, 5, Australia, Brazil, Hong Kong, Japan, and Turkey, seem likely to, or in the case of Turkey, are requiring assurance. There are 2 that haven't decided yet, and the UK is not, I think, planning to require assurance. And the issue here is that if allowing different jurisdictions to make their own decisions about whether to have assurance, about the timing of the assurance, the level of assurance, so should it be limited or reasonable, and what actually limited assurance means, may negatively impact the comparability of these disclosures, as users may place less weight on disclosures that have not been assured, which in turn may affect their decision usefulness. So this is perhaps an issue that should be considered further. But at this point, I'm going to hand over to Adam to talk about the report's recommendations.
Thanks, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. If we can move forward, maybe 2 slides, please. Thank you. So as Kate said, I'm going to go through the recommendations in the report. We don't have time on this webinar to go through each of them, but we've included them here on this slide and on a couple of other slides, just to really show you the format that they're in, which is copied across from the report. And I can explain a little bit about the approach we have taken in the report. So there are 21 recommendations in total, which we've categorized into 11 key issue areas. And for each of the recommendations, as you'll see, as summarized here, they also list who would be primarily responsible for implementing that recommendation, whether it's the ISSB or national governments, legislators, or regulatory bodies. And finally, there's also a proposed time frame for undertaking each of the recommendations. And you'll see in the report that there are a couple of recommendations we see as being immediate actions, whereas others are more perhaps short to medium term actions. But in that sense, it's a sort of rolling action plan. You'll also see in the report that the recommendations correlate very closely with the issues that we explored as part of the jurisdictional case studies, which obviously Kate has just briefly touched upon. And so in that way, it should be clear in the report why we've made each of those recommendations based on what we found through our case study exercise. But that's not to say that the jurisdictional case studies are the sole informant of the recommendations. They also reflect the very helpful and informative views of the various market participants via the input of the IRSG ISSB standard subgroup. And they also draw upon the work of other key industry groups as well. So if we just go back a slide. So I said I wasn't going to go through each of the recommendations, but I did want to talk briefly about 3 of the recommendations which we identified in the report as being key priorities. The first of these is to align local standards fully with the ISSB standards. And this is really the cornerstone of our recommendations. As Kate mentioned, being voluntary, the ISSB standards rely on national governments and legislators to bring in local laws in order to make those standards mandatory in any particular country. And that's what we're essentially seeing happening, as Kate mentioned, or is in the process of happening in each of the jurisdictions that we surveyed, and of course, many others. None of the jurisdictions we surveyed have taken the approach of simply cross-referring to the ISSB standards, and we don't expect that to be a practice that will occur in many other countries either. Now, that's not problematic in itself, but it does mean that there is obvious scope in that local legal transposition process to pick and choose which parts of the ISSB standards to adopt into local law. So our recommendation, therefore, is quite simple. That countries should make sure their local implementing laws fully align with the ISSB standards to ensure global consistency and enhance comparability of disclosures, which should make them more meaningful to investors and other stakeholders, which is, of course, the ultimate objective of the ISSB standards. The second part of the recommendation here is where when group consolidated disclosures are prepared, to ensure that there's not a requirement to also present local subsidiary disclosures on a standalone basis. The reasons for that are hopefully fairly self-evident. To avoid duplication and cost for companies operating in complex corporate structures across multiple jurisdictions, which is indeed a very real and current issue that companies are facing, and one which we get a lot of questions about. Moving on to the second key priority recommendation, and sorry, just if we just stay on the previous slide. Yeah, thank you. So this is the recommendation here is where appropriate to extend transition reliefs for scope 3 and for non-climate disclosures from 1 year, as envisaged by the ISSB transition reliefs, to 2 years. Now, this is a recommendation which, again, picking up on what Kate was saying, acknowledges the practical challenges that organizations face in preparing comprehensive disclosures, particularly around scope 3 emissions and around non-climate sustainability factors. And so it tries to balance, on the one hand, the readiness of preparers on the other hand, the needs for transparency. And again, this was a very significant theme that came out of the jurisdictional case studies, as Kate mentioned in her segment, but one which, again, we wanted to tread quite carefully on. And so as an important footnote to this, the report tries to elaborate on what we mean when we say where appropriate. And essentially what we're saying here is if there are jurisdictions that have not previously implemented TCFD-based climate disclosures, so the predecessor to ISSB, then in those countries, they should consider a phased approach to extending the transition relief, recognizing that in those countries, report preparers don't quite have the same practice, you might say, in this style of reporting, and so they need a bit more time to build their capacity to do so. Conversely, it may be less appropriate for jurisdictions with prior TCFD-based climate disclosures to grant additional extensions, as they, in theory, should be better prepared for the transition from TCFD to ISSB. And then the final key priority here is to provide a clear public timetable for endorsement and implementation of the ISSB standards, minimizing delay wherever possible. And again, this is fairly self-explanatory. A clear timetable is critical, really, to minimizing delays in implementing the ISSB standards, reducing uncertainty for report preparers and other people who have interests in those reports, investors and stakeholders, and ensuring the timely availability of decision useful data for investors as well. So with that, and I think I'm finishing just about on time, I will draw our segment to a close, and I'll hand back to Ilan.
Thanks, Adam, and thank you, Kate. So as you've heard, huge amounts in the report, not enough time to cover it all in detail, but really you've had a really good overview there of what the report found. I could sum it up in 3 numbers: 8 countries, 21 recommendations, and then 11 key issues. And maybe a 4th number, which I'm going to focus on, which is really just the 3 kind of top priority recommendations, which Adam and Kate and the team have found. So that's, to reiterate them, local laws should be whilst integrated with the standards. It needs to be aligned as much as possible, because really as consistent as possible. We appreciate that will sometimes there will need to be variations around for particular national circumstances, but minimizing that is really key to getting that globally consistent approach. Transition relief for scope 3, certainly as you heard, in jurisdictions where they haven't had experience of TCFD, certainly be welcome. And then a clear timetable. Investors and preparers really benefit from having a very clear idea of the timeline of when these things will be introduced. So that was my sort of top 3 takeaways with some figures for you. We're now going to move on to our panel. If I can ask the panelists to come reveal themselves. Hi, Chelsea. And hi, I think we've got Richard. Hi, and hi, Lisa. So we're very privileged today to have 3 expert panelists in the field of sustainability reporting. We've tried to cover all angles. We've got a standard, we've got one that developed the standards, one that helps implement the standards, and one that's using the standards. So hopefully you've got all kind of angles of working with the International Sustainability Standards Board recommendations are there. So I'll start off with Richard, introducing you. Hi, Richard Barker, who is a full-time member of the ISSB and a board member as well, I believe. But you come from a background of academia. You were former professor of accounting, I believe, at the Sade Business School in Oxford. And you also have both UK and European, I believe, standard setting and advisory background, sitting both in the past on the FRC in the UK and on FRAG in Europe. So a phenomenal amount of experience that you're bringing to this issue. So thank you very much. And then at the national level, we're very privileged to have Lisa French from Canada, who is the Vice President of Sustainability Standards at the Canadian, I'm not going to get the full title without reading it because it is quite long, but it's effectively the Canadian body which is implementing the ISSB standards in Canada. But you're also a former Chief Technical Officer from the GRI, is that right? So also some really great in-depth experience there. And then finally, Chelsea Wallace, who is Head of Sustainability Engagement and Disclosure at Standard Chartered, the international bank. And she is leading the strategy for integrating ESG risk inside the company's enterprise-wide risk management framework. But you also have a background in data analytics and decision modeling. So hopefully we won't get too technical into decision modeling or data analytics, if that's okay, Chelsea, but it's great to have you on the panel. So welcome to all 3 of you. I'm going to kick off with our first big open question, but a reminder to those of you on the webinar that please do use the Zoom chat to submit your questions, and which I'll be stopping, interrupting the panelists and putting those questions to them during the course of the webinar. So our first one is a nice big high level one. We've looked at, we've heard from the authors of the report. It highlights some of the concerns that jurisdictions face in the divergence of adopting the ISSB standards, because as we're all familiar, that will risk fragmenting global markets and also delaying that transition to that critical information that investors need on a globally consistent basis. But as I highlighted, and as Kate and Adam did, there's also obviously differences in national circumstances and the level of development of capital markets and legal frameworks in each country, which we have to be aware of. So how can we get that balance right? How can international regulators, businesses, policymakers work together to try and get that balance right and ensure the consistent and interoperable adoption of the standards? So a nice big easy opener for you. Richard, I'm going to hand over to you first to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So I think it's really important at this stage to point to our jurisdictional adoption guide, which sets out what adoption means from, and not least what adoption means from our point of view. And so for us, the critical issue is whether jurisdictions are functionally equivalent. In other words, they can have a different label on the standards, but as long as they are in essence saying the same thing, then they are functionally equivalent. And fully adopting from our point of view. And so in the same way that we publish on our website information about full adoption of accounting standards, we will in due course also publish on our website those that are fully adopting the sustainability disclosure standards. So, and then there are different categories of adoption, as it were, partial adoption and so on. and different levels of transition relief that different jurisdictions are adopting. So it will be transparent, the extent to which different jurisdictions are fully aligned, are functionally aligned or not. There is an obvious economic incentive to jurisdictions to be functionally aligned. So that's a market mechanism. Obviously, we can't control what jurisdictions choose to do, but we can encourage that alignment.
And so I'm hearing really the substance over the form. You're not as fussed about how they label it or how it works, but ultimately you want the substance to be there. And hopefully, in terms of absolutely, it's a voluntary standard, but Clifford Chance and using the ISSB's own jurisdiction guide, there's lots of materials out there for those that want to be as globally consistent as possible. So
just very briefly, there's a good test case within the case studies that have been illustrated today, which is Australia. So in Australia, in the early stages of its process, was not particularly aligned, and then through the process of consultation, got very strong feedback to say, you know what, it's going to help Australian companies to be aligned with the global standard, and so they are now aligned. So I think there is a natural market mechanism there.
Oh, it's nice to hear that investors and preparers from all sorts of jurisdictions are sharing that view. So why not hand over to Chelsea then next, because you're a preparer, I believe, and you're probably also a user of this information. So what's your take on this question?
Yeah, I'm actually quite glad that Richard used the example of Australia to end his comments with, because I think that consultation is really important as a preparer to make sure that different views are heard, and how do we work together at a very practical and somewhat human level. It's about a willingness to listen to the considerations of the different parties that are involved in these preparations. And for us, you know, ISSB is going to be a success if it can promote that frictionless flow of capital to where it's needed most at the lowest possible cost. And it's a huge opportunity for us from a disclosures perspective, considering our footprint and role as a super connector between markets. So the last thing that I want to see is disclosures for disclosure's sake popping up across all of these different markets. So I spend and focus a lot of my time on having conversations with regulators in local markets who are trying to adopt these standards to level set those expectations, and tools like this report are going to be incredibly helpful to bring into those discussions, because what's been happening in those bilateral engagements is that you can shift perspectives, but only when you're able to educate on what the real issues are with trying to implement this on the ground. So when I have very real world examples of what this means from a cost perspective, because I'm going to have to create 10 different systems that can accommodate the different jurisdictions, suddenly it becomes real, and there's more willingness to start to collaborate and see how we can come together to find something that is a global baseline. So I also really liked the one of the recommendations in the report that's around that promotion of voluntary early adoption of the standards to familiarize preparers, and also providing clear public timetables, because I think both of those will help enough people get the right information so that they can start to effectively work together to get to that global baseline standard. And from a public timetable perspective, it's helpful for us when we're planning out what our work needs to look like for the future, if we've just got clear guidance from those jurisdictions of what's coming ahead.
Sounds very sensible, and I love your emphasis on frictionless flow of capital. I think maybe we'll come to later the fact that the world doesn't feel that frictionless at the moment, with all sorts of other things going on. However, certainly doing what we can in terms of sustainability standards to promote that frictionless flow is really, really important. So Lisa, what's the Canadian take on this question? How is going there, and how can we learn from you?
Okay, first, quick clarification. My previous role was at the International Integrated Reporting Council, so just wanted to put that out there. And I'm going to say I do not speak on behalf of Canada, nor do I speak on behalf of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board today. What I'm going to do is share my views, and my views alone. I need to be quite cautious about that. So I am going to start, though, with the problem side of the equation, before moving on to my very, very, very reluctant solution to the problem. So I think we have to basically flat out acknowledge that jurisdictions are at wildly different stages when it comes to sustainability disclosure. And I guess, as you've alluded to, in this world of what's up is down and what's down is up, it is sometimes the countries that have the most sophisticated and deeply entrenched financial reporting systems and regulatory frameworks that take the longest time to adapt, at least in the absence of strong policy or political will. And so when it comes to newer disclosure initiatives, it's why we sometimes see developing countries leapfrog their developed country counterparts. So there's certainly a practical or operational consideration when it comes to getting all jurisdictions on the same page. But I also think that there's a heavy ideological perspective at play. And I'm going to give an example of what I mean in accounting terms. So the International Accounting Standards Board's latest practice statement on management commentary calls for disclosure through the lens of a company's ability to create value, where value is more expansive than the financial bottom line alone. By contrast, if you look to the North American counterpart, the Management's Discussion and Analysis, or MD&A, there the lens is explaining financial statement performance and prospects. So a more narrow view in that case. So all the while these similar models apply different lenses, they drive different disclosures, they drive different ways of thinking, and they drive different ways of behaving. And therein lies a bit of the challenge that we face today. We want consistency and interoperability, but we're applying different lenses to very similar vehicles. And if I put it bluntly, some of those lenses position sustainability information as essential to decision-making. Other lenses position that same information as more of a compliance exercise. So now to my very reluctant solution. I'm almost inclined to think that we need to take a bit of a slow down before we can speed up approach to ensure that we're all, or at least we're mostly, moving forward in a truly coherent way. And I am very impatient, so I do hate saying that. And there are limits to it, of course. You know, it doesn't mean stalling or stopping by any stretch of the imagination to accommodate those who simply refuse to get on board. But it does mean accommodating those who need that little extra time to adapt, and we need to continue to welcome them to the table.
Thank you for that. And I think we're probably going to come back to explore that question of how long do we wait, although certainly introducing the idea of ideology in accounting, I have to thank you for that, because that's not something that probably most of us have thought about before, but it is a really interesting take. So before I go on to my next question, we've got one from the audience, which I think we could deal with quite quickly, which is that when it comes to most jurisdictions, and I appreciate most, this report looked at 8, but perhaps, Richard, you have a broader sense. Have most jurisdictions just focused on ISSB for listed companies, or have they gone broader than that? So in the UK, I seem to remember that TCFD was listed first and then moved to wider corporates beyond that. How have existing jurisdictions tackled the ISSB adoption? And then perhaps, Lisa, we could hear from you about how Canada's doing that, although appreciating you don't speak for Canada. So Richard, have you got any thoughts on that? Oh, I think Richard might have frozen. In which case, if he has, then hopefully Richard will rejoin. And Lisa, why don't you tackle?
Give us a Canadian example first, Lisa, I wonder.
Yes.
Sure. Oh, me?
Yes, please.
Okay. So yes, in the first instance, we're maintaining the same focus as IFRS S1 and S2. However, we do currently have a strategic plan that is out for consultation where we are exploring, do we expand further? So do we look to small and medium enterprises? Do we look to public sector entities? So it is an open question, but for the time being, yes, it is that focus on larger listed entities. And
Chelsea, what do you think? You talked about how you would prefer a sensible roadmap. You liked the idea of voluntary adoption first. What about in terms of, I appreciate you're a listed company, so you'll go, Standard Chartered will be preparing anyway, but what about for clients? Do you think that's something that should be listed only, or should it go broader?
Oh, I mean, from our perspective, ideally it goes broader, and I think it gets to the point around data collection. And for us to be able to produce our financed emissions calculations, we need that information coming from our corporates.
Yeah, I think, and that's something which we know, those of you following the current EU debate around re-looking at their own sustainability standards and how wide and far they should be applied. I think they're struggling with that the finance industry does need the widest possible set of disclosures, but yet that, you know, they've got to balance that off with the burden on smaller companies. Richard, I think we have you back now.
Yeah, I'm having connection problems. I'm not sure why. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Do you want the question repeated, or are you okay with it?
No, I've got the question, but yeah, I think it's almost a non-question actually, because if you're doing sustainability reporting well, using our standards, then you are communicating to your investors on value creation and business resilience. So actually it's communication that you would want to be doing anyway. It's the first point, if it's done well. And if what you're doing is not that, then you're not doing it properly, right? So in that sense, it almost doesn't matter. But also bear in mind that the reporting is value chain reporting. And so even if you're not a listed entity, then there is a very good chance that your suppliers or your customers are, and that they will be demanding information from you. It's also in your interest to be ahead of that process. It will reach you eventually, even if it doesn't straight away. So I think the question, it feels to me, right, my impression anyway, it feels that it's a do we have to comply kind of question, and I think that's not the right way to think about it.
No, I think that's fair, and I don't believe that whoever asked it in that way. But I take your point. Although you won't get me invited back if you label my questions as non-questions. This could be the last webinar that I host. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is around transition and enforcement. So the report recommends the phased implementation and to provide time for capacity building efforts to support companies. And we also talked about that voluntary first where possible can be a useful approach. So how should we look at the role of regulators in getting that balance right of ensuring effective implementation? To Richard's point about, you know, this shouldn't be just a compliance exercise, but at the same time, regulators need to, where it is mandatory, do need to have some form of enforcement approach, whilst also, you know, not supporting companies to report and also ensuring there's a consistent and credible sort of level of reporting across each jurisdiction. Richard, I think that feels mostly targeted at you, but why don't I come to Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a regulator, but you know, for me, the critical issue here is sustainability reporting is in its relatively speaking in its infancy, and it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're a very large public company that's been doing it for years. You're still new into this process, and your reporting will be full of estimation and judgment, and that's unavoidable. And so I think good regulation is not deferring and transitioning until such time as everyone's got the right answer, because that's going to be too late. And investors don't want to wait until they've got the right answer. They want to have the best information the company has, with appropriate caveats about the quality of that information and the measurement uncertainty and so on. So I think good regulation is recognizing that estimation is intrinsic to the process and making it clear that the disclosure, it clarifies where there is estimation and where the data can be more or less relied upon.
Okay, thank you for that, Lisa. Is that how the Canadians are adopting it?
So I am very happy that we are talking about that natural tension between, you know, the high quality disclosure on the one hand and accessing reliable data, much of which is going to come from, as Richard has mentioned already, from value chain partners, so from small and medium enterprises, and from emerging markets. So finding that the balance between that natural tension. So I will say that I am squarely on the side of entities dipping their toe in the pool sooner rather than later, even if it's only behind the scenes during transition relief periods. Because if companies, as to Richard's point, if companies wait until everything is perfect, then they'll quite honestly wait forever. And in fact, it's that very act of getting started that highlights where the pitfalls and the challenges arise. So it's easy for me to say, hey, just get started, but that is where the regulators can try to help to shape the context, at least in the near term, in terms of phase-ins or safe harbor provisions. again, I work in the standard setting side, so I'm going to, not the regulatory side, so I'm going to now return to my lane. And I'll just close by saying that I think it's important that large listed entities recognize, and I'm sure they do, that their success is contingent on the success of their value chain partners. And I've heard Emmanuel Faber actually liken this to...
That's the chair of the ISSB, for those.
Sorry, yes, thank you. He's likened those large companies as the locomotive of a train that brings all of the other train cars or value chain partners along on that journey. And so I very much subscribe to that same theory, that it's incumbent on large listed entities to work with and mentor their value chain partners.
And I think you could stretch that further to say it isn't just a dialogue between regulators and large companies or them and their value chain. There's also the investor lens there, isn't there? That actually dipping the toe and producing something, even if it's at early stages, but then moving towards maturity through an engagement with, dialogue with investors, which companies should be having anyway, I think is probably a really important part of this journey. Chelsea, rather than ask you the same question, I'm going to ask you a more specific one, given we're really interested in Standard Chartered's footprint across emerging and developed markets, which is quite certainly something that gives you a really different lens to look at this whole question. So you're seeing a whole range of variation in the adoption, or the approach, I should say, at all, to sustainability disclosures, from following ISSB at an early stage, adopting them, doing something completely different, as in some countries, or doing nothing at all. So can you give us some thoughts as a preparer user of ISSB standards, as in why is it so valuable? Why is it so beneficial to have that global baseline out there? And what does that do for investor confidence?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give you an idea of the size of the challenge that we currently have, we know of 27 individual markets in our market footprint that are starting or looking to adopt ISSB, or have started to talk about adopting ISSB. So you have 27 different markets, and that's over the next 2 to 3 years that we're expecting to see them come into effect. And if each one of those varies significantly in their approach, this is an enormous challenge for us from a technical perspective, from a capacity perspective, and also from just the ability to be able to manage the information flow that is going out into the public domain, especially if we're not allowed to leverage on group disclosures. So what a global baseline does is just helps internally to set really clear and reasonable requirements that we can use when we're exploring how we want to invest in different technical systems that can help us to implement ISSB across all of these different jurisdictions. And we can anticipate what that investment needs to look like over the next few years, rather than having to create bespoke solutions in all of these little markets, which to be honest, is probably going to be Excel based, because that's what everybody does when new requirements come in. So if we can have that centralized system and governance structure around data and disclosures, because we know there's a global baseline, then we also have significantly less capacity building to do on the ground in different markets, because we don't have to create mini disclosures teams in each of these markets, but actually can have a much more agile way for those teams to get access to the information that they need and enable conversations with investors. And I think, to get to your point around, how does this create confidence for investors? If you have that good global governance structure around your data, and you know what level of assurance it's going through at that global baseline level that you choose in your organization, depending on how ISSB has been adopted in various jurisdictions, investors know exactly what to expect when they're looking at your figures. And what I don't want to see, or what I worry about, is that if individual markets start to veer away from that global baseline, we may start to be asked to produce metrics at some stage that really just don't make sense for a global bank. So as a simple example, asking us to produce net zero targets at a local level when all global banks are managing these at a portfolio level. And if we're forced to start to do this and introduce these types of metrics, that can create a lot of confusion with our investor base as to how you're achieving these things. So what strategies do you have in place to make sure that all of these targets are being hit across all of your different markets?
And to build on that, your investors aren't investing in you in a particular jurisdiction. So whilst it might be useful for some, certainly political stakeholders and regulators in a jurisdiction to know your net zero footprint there, it doesn't do much for the planet, I'm imagining, because it doesn't give the totality of Standard Chartered, and it also doesn't, investors aren't going to be that interested in that. So I'm really, I think actually we should hold the back page of this report and put your comments there on 27 different markets, and if slight variance in each, how much complication does that create in complexity and lack of or less utility of your findings. That really kind of speaks for itself in terms of an endorsement of the need for jurisdictions to actually find a common way to approach this. So I'm sure Adam and Kate are very appreciative of those remarks, because you've really sort of illustrated the importance. So Lisa, I want to talk a little bit, because I'm pretty conscious of time, in terms of materiality and assurance, because that is an important part of this debate. So how is the Canadian Sustainability Standings Board thinking about supporting preparers in that need for assurance, and what role and how important is assurance and materiality assessment, and then the assurance of that assessment in the whole process?
Wow, what a bunch of questions loaded into one.
Sorry about that. I've got to be time efficient.
So as the report notes, in Canada, we are probably a ways away from the Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards, or CSDS, is becoming mandatory. And it would actually be through that mechanism that assurance requirements would be introduced or imposed. And while our IFRS S1 equivalent, so CSDS 1, includes a 2-year transition relief for beyond climate disclosure, our board nonetheless encourages companies to address wider sustainability matters as early as possible. And so the ISSB's recently published educational material on the materiality assessment will no doubt be a very helpful tool in the toolkit. Speaking of toolkits, the CSSB is actually in the process of updating its website to point to and to leverage the great work of others, including that of the ISSB. And I'll close just by quickly saying that the CSSB will soon be issuing a climate first guide to support companies in Canada on their reporting journey.
So thank you. Richard, can I ask you the same question, or same amalgam of questions, on assurance and materiality assessments, but with where you sit at the ISSB board? So looking at across jurisdictions, how do you think the different approaches are jurisdictions getting that right? And is there something more which the ISSB can do in order to support them to get that element of assurance and materiality assessments in the adoption of the standards?
So assurance is obviously not within our domain. It's a jurisdictional decision. My own view on assurance is that it's inevitable that there will be mandatory assurance, because for the same reason that it applies to financial statements, you don't have the quality and reliability of the information in the absence of the assurance and the enforcement that goes with that, and so on. So it's a matter of time. The subject matter is different, in part because it's evolving, and certainly currently, and to a degree will remain to be different over time, it seems to me. But it's a really important part of the package. On materiality, the really important thing for us is that materiality is no different for ISSB than it is for IASB. It's the same materiality test. So for us, if information is reasonably capable of affecting an investment decision, then it's material. That also illustrates how important the auditors are going to be in shaping disclosure, because it will be for the assurance profession to sign off on whether the material information is disclosed in line with the standard. I think it's really important to say in that context that practice and norms will evolve. It's not the case that S1 and S2, S1 in particular, sets out, here's what you must disclose, and it's all super clear. It's not, right? S1 is a framework for what you must disclose in effect, and the substance of that will be filled out over time, and the assurers will play an important part in scoping the information set that finally gets published and then gradually evolved.
Okay, so you're breaking up a little bit there, Richard, but I think most of us got the gist of that. And I think that's a really important point that you make, that so much of this actually will be developed and evolve in practice based on the assurance standards and how assurers and how the audit industry develops and how they approach this. I certainly think that the first year of the mandatory reporting in the EU under the European Sustainability Reporting Standards is certainly seeing a wide variation from what we understand talking to peers and clients in the way that auditors is approaching that. And I think that's certainly something which to look out for. So one of the questions on that we've been submitted, I think might be a little bit unfair to ask. So Chelsea, I'm going to ask you a variation on it. The question is there a corporate out there that's doing this really well? So I won't ask you that, but because clearly you are going to be doing it really, really well at Standard Chartered. So why don't you give us a sense of what do you think has made your reporting where you are using the standards go well, and what areas for of improvements and things that could have gone better?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I think what's made our reporting go really well is links back to assurance. So just ISSB aside, the way that we've approached a lot of our sustainability reporting more generally, even outside of TCFD requirements, has been to make sure that we were able to get limited assurance at least on most of the metrics that we're producing. So outside of the normal TCFD metrics, we also produce a lot of information about our sustainable finance mobilization, our sustainable finance revenues. And what we've done is make sure that those metrics are being assured at that limited assurance level to give our investors confidence in those numbers. And we've seen really strong positive responses from that. And we try to do what we can also to get down to the most granular level of detail to give investors helpful information. So we go to geographies, kind of show different geographies or different impact areas and break those numbers down. Now, why I think that has sort of set us up well for ISSB and preparing for that implementation is because we've got that good rhythm and structure now around sustainability reporting where new requirements come in. We can look at pre-assurance, then we can look at getting limited assurance, and know the rigor that our data needs to go through before it gets to the reporting phase. So I do actually look at assurance as kind of a differentiator a little bit. I know it's an incredibly painful process if you have to go through it yourself, but it does set you up for success.
Okay, I challenge that then. So I share, and I've heard similar in terms of the difficulties, but some say that actually limited assurance isn't actually that much of a boon or a assistance to preparers, certainly in the early stages, because ultimately the audit firm is concerned about what they're taking on in terms of their liabilities, and if they're putting their name to something, even though it's only a limited manner, they still are very rigorous about it, as you might expect. So is there really that much difference between limited and what would be then full assurance?
I have to say I tend to agree with you on this one. I do see a lot of rigor around limited assurance, which I think is actually probably also why, having gone through it, that sets us up for further success, because it is incredibly detailed what we have to show and document as evidence to our assurance providers.
Understood. Okay, so we're going to Richard's going to stay off camera just for because of the difficulties, but hopefully that his voice will be then clearer. But Lisa, I'm going to go to you with a question first on scope 3. It's certainly can be one of the most difficult parts of the reporting process, and that's one of the reasons why the report highlights the need for transition relief on that. How should companies balance that need when it comes to the practical difficulties of getting an agreed scope 3 figure and calculating and reporting it? And is there any learnings from what you've seen in the Canadian market for how that should be done?
Sorry, that was again, I need to digest some of that. So let me just say that of the I would say that of all of the areas that we covered throughout the consultation on CSDS 1 and 2, it was the scope 3 piece that was the most contentious.
Yeah.
And it was certainly a reflection of, gosh, it was the most complicated matter for us to address, given, just in terms of understanding the makeup of Canada, right? It is the second largest company by area. And if you're moving from east to west, north to south, you might as well be visiting 5 different countries, all with, different industries, different weather profiles. So even that sense of urgency might be felt very strongly in one region because they are actually experiencing the effects of climate change, but less so for other regions. And so again, this is sort of the list of complexities that went into determining that. So I guess I'll just sort of wrap up by saying there is definitely a fear factor, right? And there's a lot of, questions, ongoing questions about, is this double counting and what does this mean? And how are we going to get this information? And then that's frightening small companies on which our economy relies, a massive proportion of small and medium enterprises. So now we've got, that aspect of our economy also in panic mode. So not an eloquent answer, but there's a lot that we have to do to help to support because there is fear and uncertainty.
So I recognise that, and we hear that a lot in terms of Scope 3. Each country that I've been involved with these discussions, Scope 3 is always a very difficult one. Richard, voice only, but can you put your mind to that question from where you sit?
Sure. So I think the debate about Scope 3 will look very, very different 2 or 3 years from now. The rate at which data availability is increasing, systems are developing, and so on. The market can be relied upon, I think, to massively improve Scope 3. So this debate will feel very old-fashioned, not very long from now, is the first thing to say. Second thing to say is estimation is super important here. Again, what your investor wants to know is not, I don't have a Scope 3 number, will zero do? What the investor wants to know is, here's an estimate. Any company ought to have a reasonable sense of where are the big areas of exposure here. Whereabouts in the supply chain and the value chain is Scope 3. A precise number is not needed. What's needed is a ballpark number which says more or less, here's where we've got a transition charge, or here's where we've got a transition opportunity. So I think I think there's too much worry about Scope 3, to be honest, because it's misunderstood as similar to any other form of current financial reporting. We need to have an accurate number, and we're not quite sure how to do it. It needs to be an estimate. It needs to be your best estimate and qualified as such. And the quality of the estimation will improve over time. And the purpose of doing the estimation is to help investors to understand your risks and opportunities. And that leads to further disclosure about what you're doing about it. And it's actually what you're doing about it that's more important than the Scope 3 in the first place. By the way, also, norms will evolve as well, right? So a lot of the uncertainty out there right now is because you can't see what competitors are doing. And give it a couple of reporting cycles and there'll be much more comfort around that.
I think you're implying that corporates like to move in a herd, which I'm sure can't be true. Lisa, did you want to have a very, very final word on that?
All it was going to be is, I think it continues to boil down to a rules-based versus principle-based interpretation of standards. Those who are rules-based think they need to strive to that number. Those who are principles-based are looking at the point of this. So I'm just reinforcing the point that Richard made. Thanks.
Chelsea, in 30 seconds, Scope 3. You got it sorted. It wasn't an issue, or still a challenge.
I mean, I have to echo what Richard said. I think it's that's why we find PCAF data quality scores so useful, because it's a very clear indication to your investors on the transparency of the quality of the data that is going into the financed emissions reporting. So I think best estimate is exactly where it's at.
Fabulous. Well, I think that's a brilliant place to close, where I'm literally up at time now. So all that remains is for me to thank our 3 panelists. So Chelsea, Richard and Lisa, thank you so much. You've heard it all today. You've heard that it's all going to come down to assurance. we shouldn't worry too much about scope 3 for the time being, and that there is, this is an evolving situation across many different markets, and we really appreciate all of your time today. And then thanks finally to Adam and to Kate and all of the Clifford Chance team for preparing and producing this fantastic report, which clearly is going to be incredibly useful for jurisdictions. We hope that they read it, we hope they look at it, we hope they follow some of the recommendations. So thank you to everyone today for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future on another webinar.